So now we're going to have a panel. Betsy Markey, who's the governor's chief in the Office of Economic Development and International Trade, and Will Tour. No, not Will Tour, Chris Hansen. Chris Hansen. So Chris is a representative from Denver, and probably among people in the State House, the person who understands best energy issues and how they mix with a lot of other things. But thank you for joining me, Chris.
So, by the way, everybody's bio is included. So if you want to know more than what I just said, feel free to do that. Both of these folks have a very impressive bio. And I think what I'd like to do is start with Chris, because you just heard the governor speak. And he even said, the governor did in our little talk before he came on stage, that he was going to stay pretty much at 35,000 feet, and he did that. You are the fighter pilot of the energy policy world right now, because you're about 1,500 feet off the ground in the State House, bouncing up and down. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the legislative approach that will involve implementing some of the things that the governor has just talked about, and how you and the members of both the House and the Senate are going about the work of trying to put policies in place legislatively.
Thank you so much, Governor, and it's wonderful to join you here today. It's wonderful to be on this panel. Will Torr and I get confused as twins all the time, so not a problem.
That was my fault.
Yeah, it's pretty close. But lots of great work going on. I like that analogy. Yeah, you're right. It does feel like we're bouncing along in kind of full heat of the action here in the final month of the legislative session. And you're exactly right. I mean, I think we have, obviously the commitment from the governor. Part of his campaign platform was to move aggressively, assertively on clean energy issues to improve the environment here in Colorado. But that really, where the rubber meets the road, is in the legislature when we start thinking about specific bills, specific policies. And of course, we have a system that is incremental by its very nature. And while there may be, one-party control in both chambers right now, that doesn't mean we don't have a ton of really hard work to do to move things forward. And I would say, if you look at the slate of bills that have already been introduced, there are probably a few more coming that will be on the different ways we can implement the renewable energy future, the EVs, several of the things the governor mentioned. That is the hard work we're engaged in right now. I started the session with a couple of big energy bills, one on community solar gardens, one on asset securitization, which I realize is a word I can really only use in rooms like this, where we're talking about really trying to create the right environment for this transition. And I think the legislature is really seeing more clearly now the inexorable nature of the transition that we're in, that we need to think methodically about how we get Colorado from point A to point B, because we've got a massive shift happening in the utility sector, in the energy sector, and for us to wait and react is simply not an option anymore. Too many communities will be damaged, too many very painful job transitions will occur if we sit back and wait. And I think historically, unfortunately, that's what we've done. We've kind of been reactive. And I see this session and next year as sort
Always
of our
be careful when
chance.
you say historically and you have a former governor on the stage. Then my mind goes to the exceptions. But anyway, go ahead.
You were ahead of the curve, Governor. You were ahead of the curve. We are just continuing standing on the shoulder of giants.
No, I'm joking. I was joking. It's nice to have a little levity in these panel presentations, yes. Chris.
And it is April Fool's Day, which I haven't even taken advantage of yet, except maybe the Will Tour joke. But so much work to do. And I would just, one thing we have yet to be introduced, and will be a lot of work in April, is the PUC sunset bill. I know that's on minds of a lot of folks in the room. That's our once every 13 years. We do a sunset review of the PUC, and a lot of important topics to be taken on there, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to discuss those.
Yeah, I want to come back to you, and we'll talk about some specific pieces of legislation, some that you referred to, and some of the things you might not have alluded to, but that are already out there. So Betsy, first of all, you have this great background to take this job as somebody who was governor and knows what that job's about, having been with the Small Business Administration, but even more importantly, run and owned a small business, served in Congress. There's just so much here that qualifies you to be a person who's doing economic development. And so what I want to ask you is a different question. It's, really in some respects, you're marketing the state. But there's different ways to use sort of our clean energy portfolio or our clean energy ambitions to market that. And I would like you to just talk to folks about how you think about that when you're talking to companies, when you're considering a strategy to go out there and bring businesses to Colorado.
Well, first of all, I'd have to say we already have a great brand in Colorado that's been built on, it's a good place to live. When people come here, so many companies come here because, not only housing, our airport, but quality of life. And I think a lot of employers are looking at Colorado because we do have such a great quality of life, and we need to keep that as well. And so we have various tools that we have in the state to attract companies, particularly clean companies. But it goes through more than that as well. I mean, our whole office is really geared towards what can we do to, again, continue our brand as a great, clean place to live, and also attract those companies in the clean energy industry. So we have a toolbox of incentives that we can give. For instance, we have a whole slew of what's called advanced industry grants, from your proof of concept grants to infrastructure funding. And we take a certain percentage of them and make sure that they're going to clean energy industries. But beyond those tax incentives and those grants that we have, really for instance, we have the outdoor rec industry within economic development. And that really plays a key role in, again, people looking at our state as a place to go, not only to recreate, but to establish your company, because this is a place where we hike, we fish, we bike, we take care of our environment. Our outdoor rec industry is a $62 billion industry here in Colorado and employs over 500,000 people, again, in those clean jobs. Just another example is our tourism office. We have 82 million visitors from around the world that come every year to Colorado. We just instituted what we're calling Leave No Trace campaign, which is, again, you come to visit Colorado, but be environmentally sensitive, because that's who we are as a state. And so that's an initiative with the Dude and Ranch Association, the Lodging Association, several environmental groups, to really make sure that when you come here to recreate and to play and to do business, you need to be sensitive to the environment.
It'd also be fair to say that there's a lot of companies paying attention to the energy portfolio, to transportation planning, and they're thinking about this 10 and 15 and 20 years down the road when deciding whether to locate. Even if they're not in the industry, the energy industry or the outdoor rec industry, there are a lot of other fairly big companies who have that at the front of their mind.
They have that absolutely at the front of their mind. Of course, we have a governor who is happy to and has made several calls to CEOs who are looking to come to the state of Colorado to encourage them that this is a good place to do business. But as we're looking at those incentives that we have for companies, we're looking at how can we give people additional points if they're coming in and they're a clean energy industry. How can we give them extra credit for that, an additional incentive, a better tax credit? And so those are some of the things that we're looking at as well in the state.
So, Representative Hansen, if we could kind of talk a little bit about specific pieces of legislation. And I'd actually like to start with asset securitization, because I don't think everybody in the room does know what it is, and it's a pretty tough concept. New Mexico, in their 60-day session, has passed asset securitization as part of their energy planning. You introduced a bill last year, didn't make it out of the House this year. It has a different path forward, it looks like to me. Can you explain what it does and why you are supportive of it?
Yeah, thank you, Governor. That was a bill that I introduced, the first version of it in 2017. We passed it out of the House in 2017. It was then didn't make it out of committee in the Republican-controlled Senate. Brought it back this year. A few changes, nothing major. but rewrote the bill to make it available to any operator in the state. So the basic concept is you've got an operator, a utility, who decides to close down a unit. We then make available a bonding tool so they can take the residual value of that asset and turn it into a low-interest AAA bond sold on the commercial paper market like any other debt instrument. That then takes care of the residual value of that plant, and we use the savings generated by that transaction to reserve some funds to help the towns and communities where jobs will be lost or where the property tax loss would occur. And that was sort of what I was alluding to before, trying to be proactive instead of reactive, because we know from data around the country that these older fossil plants are toward the end of their life. They're not economic anymore. We're at a situation now where the average price for a coal-fired generation is somewhere in the mid-30s per megawatt hour. The alternatives in the market are coming in $20, $25 a megawatt hour for wind, solar with batteries. So the economic situation means that this transition is going to accelerate, and therefore I would love to get this piece of legislation in place so that we're ready for that transition.
So thanks. The second bill that you alluded to that I think we should talk about, while it hasn't been read across the desk, is the PUC sunset bill. Again, that could be a concept foreign to people in this room, what it means to have an agency that has a sunset review. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, I'd love to. So that bill will be starting in the Senate, all the sunset reviews, and a sunset review is essentially a chance for the legislature to look at programs, departments, divisions, and look at, is the current trajectory, is the current capability bandwidth at that unit matching what the state needs. It's just a periodic review of different functions within the state government or different programs of the state government. And every 13 years is the minimum level. We can do it more often if we want, but we look at the PUC on this regular schedule. This just happens to be the year where we're going to take a hard look at, are the capabilities, the internal bandwidth matching what we're seeing as the challenges we need to take on as a state. And I think it's a very healthy process. I'm glad we have this as a regular part of our work at the legislature. And I think, there are many things at the PUC working very well, but I think there's some things that we're going to need to take a hard look at and make sure we've kind of have the right capability inside the PUC for the future challenges.
And just for right now, we're going to talk about community solar. What's your bill on community solar do? I think Colorado is the first state to pass community solar in 2010.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And that, toward the end of your time in office, we had the first version of the Community Solar Garden bill. Community solar gardens are essentially a way for people who can't put solar on their rooftop to buy into a community, buy a piece of a community solar garden. So it might be a 2 megawatt project, and an individual resident could buy a sliver that would take care of their needs. A commercial business might buy a sliver for their energy needs. And we've really, this year, the approach in House Bill 1003 is the number, for anybody who'd like to look it up, is really to try to modernize that statute to expand the size of allowable projects. So 2 megawatts was the cap. We've moved that to 5 megawatts in the bill, which of course reduces costs for the people who sign up for it. Much lower marginal cost, about 25% lower when you go slightly bigger projects. And then the second thing was to remove the geographic restriction that was in the statute. The current law says that the project has to be in the county or adjacent county of the subscriber, and we've now changed that in the bill to the service territory which the subscriber lives in. So it opens up tremendous economic growth opportunities for rural counties that previously couldn't participate.
So this is a really interesting thing, and this is my own comment, the moderator's prerogative, as I used the last time in a panel. When you do something, and especially if you do it sort of at the front end of it, you don't necessarily get everything inside of it right, and you certainly don't get it all, you don't necessarily exhaust all the possibilities. And one of the things that's been fascinating in watching the evolution since really 2007, but particularly in the first few months the things that you are doing that are the second or third iteration of things that we thought about first. We were the first state to have it, but there's all these improvements upon it that we now understand can really change it, and it's one of the things no person who ever's done public policy should think that it can't be improved or that they're the last person to do a good job at it. Betsy, so one of the things that's being talked a lot about in this country is, and I don't want you to talk specifically about the Green New Deal, but you know, the inside of that is building an economy on jobs that are tied to the energy transition that we're talking about at this symposium. How important is that to you, again, as the Director of Economic Development? And then what's the strategy you use if it is important? I'm assuming it is. If it is important, what's the strategy you use to go and find ways to build clean energy employment in Colorado?
Well, first of all, working with, I know, Governor, you have worked with states around the country to help them build on what you did when you were governor and hear their ideas. So I think part of that, too, is working statewide, across states, too, to find out what is working, what's not working. You know, Chris mentioned rural Colorado. And, you know, we know that if all parts of the state are to grow and thrive, not just the Denver metro area, we need to make sure that we have an ecosystem in place for rural Colorado. And that includes good paying green jobs that can't be outsourced. You know, we see in places like Garfield County, the other parts of the western slope where they're so dependent on property taxes and severance taxes from oil and gas, and that's just not sustainable. And you see so many of those communities debrucing to try, because Tabor is a huge impediment, of course, to be able to keep some of that money for a rainy day fund. And you see those counties on their own really looking for other ways to diversify their economy that's not just dependent on oil and gas. And a lot of that is, you know, in the renewable energy industry, in clean jobs. You know, when I go to the Eastern Plains, I'm always amazed at the wind and solar projects, and a lot of them are funded through programs like our enterprise zone tax credits. And one of the things that we're really trying to push now too is to really make sure that we get more companies who are looking at investing in businesses in clean tech with those enterprise tax credits. So looking at what we're doing and how can, you know, we recalibrate some of our incentive programs to really promote a cleaner economy across Colorado. How can we do things, for instance, such as get people off the road? When a company comes to look at what do you have available, they may want to be in Denver, but we're looking at saying to them, well, yeah, but maybe we could give you something extra if you allow your employees to work remotely, because we don't want, you know, another 2,000 cars on the road again. So can we incentivize you to let you have your workers work in rural Colorado or work from their home, again, to as just another way to continuing to think about how we can continue to green Colorado.
I know it's early in the administration, but so Chris talked about places where there's probably either currently or there is currently or probably going to be in the future, near future, a shutdown of coal-fired generation, which is also going to impact the coal mining industry. How much thought has been given to date about transitions, about workforce transitions? Part of it could come from securitization, right. But, you know, are we going to be thinking about retraining workforces, or are there things, jobs that can be done in either reclaiming the land or in taking down coal-fired generation where people don't necessarily have to be retrained and can stay in their communities?
Yeah. And we're working a lot with the Department of Local Affairs on that. They have grants available for communities who have been impacted by displacement of the coal industry, programs to retrain those workers. We also have programs to retrain workers to take on a new responsibility in an emerging industry or for different jobs. I think that's critical. But also looking at new emerging industries in the state. For instance, the governor and I last Friday were at a hemp expo. And there were 10,000 people there. They could have had 20,000, but the space only accommodated that many. There were so many people from around the state who are really looking at that as an emerging industry. Industries like fintech and blockchain. So we're really trying to push looking at those emerging industries where there are job opportunities throughout all parts of Colorado. So
the other thing I should say to you is the woman who's the assistant director of the Center for the New Energy Economy was she's an energy economist of sorts. She was at NREL and she did a study of the Rush Creek wind farm built by XL and the economic impact. And so when I was governor, we knew that ag had over 20 years about a 2% profit year to year on average. Years where there were losses, years where there were gains. And really clean energy in rural Colorado, particularly eastern Colorado, has added an entire economy, an agricultural economy that's improved at the margin certainly by job creation, by direct and indirect employment. And is that something that you can take to the people of eastern Colorado and, again, market it as part of what the state's strategy is?
Yes, absolutely, because you see these farmers and ranchers that are allowed to put wind turbines on their land, and they get all that passive income, and then the county gets that income as well. So continuing to promote those industries and other agritourism industries that'll create those good jobs in those parts of the state that still haven't seen the economic growth that the Front Range has. So we'll continue to figure out those kinds of strategies that will help, particularly the eastern part of the state.
You're shaking your head, Chris.
Oh, I'm in total agreement with that. My hometown's Goodland, Kansas, so I get to drive past these things, every time I go home to see my family. And you're absolutely right. Great passive income, great additional property tax. It's changed the income profile of huge swaths of eastern Colorado and other parts of the state. I was just going to add, I appreciate you mentioning the DOLA grants that are available for some of this transition. I think the issue, though, is that we're just not at the point where we have adequate resource for the size of the challenge. So the DOLA grants, I've had a chance this year to serve on the Joint Budget Committee, and we looked, kind of line by line at the different parts of the DOLA budget. And unfortunately, it's only $500,000 a year for those grants. And we're talking about a challenge that's going to be thousands of jobs, millions in lost property tax revenue for those localities and those counties. And so I think with House Bill 1037 and other legislative efforts, we're trying to build something that's going to be a little bit more up to the size of what we're going to be confronting so that we're ready for that. That's kind of that, instead of being reactive, trying to get ready for it. And I think the other hidden item that I think might be worth mentioning today is also the change in water rights. So one of the things that happens when you shut down an old fossil-fired plant that typically has thousands or even 10,000 acre feet of water rights, very senior water rights that go back decades. I think there's some fascinating economic development opportunities that could be unlocked because of a change in water use. But I also think we have to be very transparent and clear with people that it's not a one-for-one transition either. Even if we're able to repower these facilities, retrain some of the workers who are there, there is going to be dislocation. And I think we can, folks like the OEDIT office and DOLA, we've got some great tools in place, but we're going to have to be very creative, very assertive in how we handle this transition. Otherwise, I think, we could be repeating history in the Rust Belt and, the other big transitions we've seen across the country. So I just, we got to be clear-eyed about it and get ready for the size of the challenge.
And I think part of that, too, is having communities really think through where do they want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? How do you want to brand yourself? What kind of diversification of industry makes sense for your community? On the Eastern Plains, it might be wind, it might be solar, it could be agritourism, it could be bird watching, lots of different ways. It could be growing your outdoor rec industry. We've got 3 paddleboard manufacturers in rural Colorado, and that's a booming industry. And one of the things we like to do as well is to take some of these small companies overseas to trade shows to really try to expand their access to markets around the world through grants, and then also working to get foreign direct investment to our clean energy industry as well.
So I talked about this earlier, that when in an earlier panel, 9 governors, candidates, some of them were incumbents, campaigned on something on the order of 100%, either 100% clean or 100% renewable. You say 100% clean, you look at the California model, where Governor Brown signed legislation, said we'll do 60% renewable, and then the other 40% we're going to call clean, carbon free. We just don't know how we're going to get there quite yet. It could be technology that we have not developed yet, or technology we know about that we improve upon, whatever. It's been interesting in Colorado. I think when people heard Governor-elect Polis or candidate Polis talk about 100% renewable, they assumed that would come through maybe some of the conventional policy mechanisms like renewable portfolio standards or a clean energy standard. And that's not the case. And he's been pretty clear about it, that he's not a person who supports mandates or what he considers a top-down mandate. And so we're not going to see a 100% bill this session. We're not going to see something, at least, that I think he'll support coming. And so we still have this ambition of, in the climate bill, of decreasing our emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. We also have an ambition of, and he just set it a goal of 100% renewables, I think by 2040. And so how do we do that without the kinds of mechanisms other states are employing right now? Clean energy standard, renewable portfolio standard, or even carbon cap and trade?
Yeah, Governor, it's a wonderful question. I mean, obviously lots of different ideas on the table right now. I guess I would say we are in this wonderful position that we've got an economic imperative, and the pricing in the market is such that, you know, the discussion when you were in office was, how can we do this with the least amount of ratepayer impact? Now we're to the point where the faster we do it, the more we save ratepayers money. So, you know, we have, in a sense, crossed the economic Rubicon when it comes to the pricing of clean tech, and it's only going to improve. I mean, the price of batteries are down 90%. The price of solar is down 90% since 2010. Wind is down 70% since 2010. So we're going to continue to see price drops there. So in my mind, I kind of feel like we've got this wonderful welling up of bottom-up technology options, combination of wind, solar, batteries, et cetera, that are going to make things easier and easier for that transition to happen at the block by block level. And we've got this amazing opportunity, if we think kind of top down structurally in the system, we've got this amazing opportunity to have better interconnection with our neighbors. And I wanted to make sure I brought up today kind of this ongoing discussion about RTOs or ISOs, regional transmission organizations. Colorado is relatively islanded in the grid. And the more islanded you are, the more difficult it is to bring in more intermittent sources. And so I would say we're going to need both better interconnection and all this wonderful new technology to hit the goals that the governor has laid out. And if we're successful on both sides of that equation, then I think mandates become unnecessary. I mean, think about just the RPS in Colorado, 30%, but Excel is on the way to 55% with no mandate. Why? Because it was the best option for the ratepayer. So mandates, fine, let's put in another number if we need to, but I feel like we've got the market dynamic at this point that if we can get the transmission figured out and have the right competition for all that new technology to come into the market, I think we're going to be in a great position.
You mentioned Goodland, Kansas. That's pretty interesting because Kansas has built an entire wind industry on the western plains of Kansas, and largely, not largely, I would say in large part, because they're selling into the Southeast Power Pool and part of an RTO. We've done a bunch of work in Nebraska. Nebraska only had 475 megawatts of wind when we started there. They have now about 735, but they're the 4th windiest state in the country, and they've islanded themselves because of their public power districts and have not sold into the Southwest Power Pool. Southwest Power Pool, and I think their ability to do so is now something they're thinking a lot more about in terms of developing wind. So, Betsy, back to you, and this is now in your hat as a cabinet member. The stuff we're talking about, energy and climate, it doesn't actually just touch economic development or the energy office. It really is cross-sectored. And do you and other members of the cabinet, Do you have a way of thinking about this that's a collective mentality and helps you think about, well, what does the energy future of Colorado look like, and how's that going to impact all these other places we kind of sometimes stovepipe when we're talking about government?
Right, yeah. And one of the things that the governor has done is have a series of cross-cabinet working groups, and I'm a part of a couple of them, and one of them is the energy working group. And so it's of course led by our energy office, but it's our office, it's Department of Regulatory Affairs, it's Local Affairs, it's Department of Agriculture, all really looking at this issue. And we've just had 2 meetings so far, so we're still early on, but I think it's important really to work cross-cabinet-wise, because we all have goals in our department on how do we help the governor achieve that goal of 100% renewable by 2040. And so we all have a key role to play in that, every agency who's in that working group. So yeah, we are working together, and and our role is what tools do we have in economic development to really, again, incentivize businesses and individuals as well, but particularly businesses to attract those clean energy companies here.
And can I just follow up on that? So there's been now a climate bill introduced in the House. It's Speaker Becker's bill. Again, pretty public that there was a lot of back and forth between the governor and the speaker about what was going to wind up in that bill. When you have that energy meeting, the energy session about 100% renewable, is climate a part of that discussion, or is it all about achieving the 100% renewable and climate's not so much the purview of the cabinet, it's just more what the governor and the speaker have been talking about?
I think we don't have any specific, climate goals right now in terms of numbers. But again, everything that we're looking at, the Department of Agriculture, of course, and looking at, emissions and, what they can do in the agriculture arena, particularly in the farming and ranching, and what are their specific goals? Public health and environment, what additional things can they do with regard to methane and water monitoring? I think we all really are looking at at how we also within our agencies just a small thing that we're working on with energy office is the governor is focused on making electric vehicles more accessible here in Colorado, and so we look at that as well. How can we play a role in that? Do we put EV charging stations at all of our welcome centers? Do we encourage our tourists here to go on the byways in an EV car? So I think everyone is trying to take a look at these goals of the governor, and how can we, in our own sphere of influence, impact that.
You mentioned recreational tourism, and this symposium a year and a half ago at CSU, Governor Mead from Wyoming was on the stage with Governor Bullock from Montana, Governor Hickenlooper, and asked Governor Mead, who was, from the #1 coal-producing state and had seen the coal industry and the throes of some difficulties, 3 companies in bankruptcy, and I said, Governor, why would you sign on to a memorandum of understanding among 7 or 8 governors that said we're going to build out an EV infrastructure in Wyoming? And he said it's because recreational tourism is our #2 industry, and we're not going to keep that #2 spot as an industry if we don't build out an EV infrastructure.
Exactly. The other thing Governor Mead did, which was also very smart, is to make sure that all parts of Wyoming had good broadband access, because that way you can attract. They've got a lot of cloud storage companies now in Wyoming. The climate is right for it, and they have invested in that infrastructure so they could diversify from oil and gas.
It looks like you want to hop in on this question, Chris.
Just a quick sidebar. I just want to say the state is still under Governor Hickenlooper's executive order that basically ties us to Paris targets. So we currently have climate targets. In fact, 50% of the U.S. population lives in a jurisdiction that is at Paris or better for climate targets, and Colorado would be in that mix. So just to mention, we do have a baseline that we're starting from.
So since we're talking about that, we're going to talk a little bit more about that Becker bill, because there's some interesting language in there about the PUC and about not mandating things. It's really interesting. It looks to me, in part, again, like the governor's influence on trying to stay away from some mandating. And there's obviously going to be a relationship between the Air Quality Control Commission and the Public Utility Commission, both impacting emissions in different ways, right? But that bill really looks to the Air Quality Control Commission as sort of the chief rulemaking body for the climate bill. So tell me a little bit about how that's structured so that they and the PUC can still work in tandem but not mandate things that is in the PUC's purview. It's really interestingly worded.
Yeah, I would agree. And just to say, we haven't even got to the first committee in the first chamber yet, so long distance to travel with that piece of legislation. But I would say you're absolutely right in the way you described it. We've got a relationship that would be set up if the legislation passes as written. Of course, we'll have amendments as we go. But it does set up a very important back and forth between PUC and air quality. I would say for the PUC, it probably looks like something around an imputed carbon price in planning. Right now, during the ERP process, the PUC, if I remember right, uses a $20 a ton assumption for one of its scenarios. I would say you're going to see more action in that category of analysis, that the PUC would be looking at potential carbon cost in the future as part of its planning today. So that would be one concept I would imagine will get more attention as we go forward under that type of construct. But you're absolutely right. There'll be this important back and forth. But the thing I would say is that we're on a very positive path forward in the power sector right now. The big work ahead of us is going to be in transportation and heating. So the air quality folks are going to have to look at rulemaking, if we move forward with this construct, to go after what is going to end up being 80% of the remaining emissions in a few years as the power sector continues to decarbonize. So not that problems are solved in power sector, but we've heard the announcement from operators in the state, the direction we want to go. Now we have to start what will be more difficult work in transportation and in the heating sector. Transportation, again, very bright future. Rapid adoption of EVs looks fairly likely to me, considering the rapid decrease in battery costs and the infrastructure we're doing with legislative and executive branch with EV bills this year. But that I think will now be kind of the next phase of the policy work. Is after we're feeling like we're on a great trajectory in the electricity sector, then we got to start the much harder work in the heating sector.
Well, and the transportation sector is, I think, as difficult in some respects. And partly that's because state policy can have such a great impact on energy delivery and electricity utility sector systems. But the transportation sector is still importantly led by a lot of federal policy. And so that's I think, partly the open question is what states are going to be able to do to drive that. So Betsy, let's talk about the transportation sector and the kinds of things that you think about as the Director of Economic Development in trying to build out an EV infrastructure, but at the same time lure companies here because we've done that. Be able to either lure companies that care about that or companies that are looking 10 years down the road and saying, we're going to be electrified, we're going to be automated, or we're going to be part of a shared economy, or we're going to be all three. Of course, the education piece, healthcare, and then transportation. Those are huge issues that companies are looking at before they're trying to decide which state in order to expand to or to relocate to. And you do see that a lot of those communities that, particularly those communities on the Front Range that have access to RTD, places like Lone Tree and in that area where you see a lot of new businesses coming into those areas because their employees can get to work using public transportation. I know CDOT is looking at expanding things like Bustang. I take the Bustang. I live in Fort Collins. I take it on Monday morning and take it home on Friday. And how do you and really how do you make sure that people know that those are options that exist? But again, in terms of the infrastructure. Again, how do we, we're just starting on the whole EV part. How do we incentivize companies? We're building out that infrastructure, which is not in place right now. But when we do, I think that'll go a long way towards letting companies know that, hey, we have this is a clean state. We've got lots of different multimodal transportation options, even though we haven't gotten federal fundings for our roads yet. So this is a question to both of you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, so start thinking of your questions. But it's kind of the elephant in the middle of the room right now in Colorado if you're talking about energy and economic development, and that has to do with the oil and gas sector. And the governor referred to the fact that I think the bill's on the way back to the House or the Senate. It's a Senate bill, so it's on the way back to the Senate because the House amended some things, and so the House will do their consideration of the amendments and likely pass it and go to the governor's desk. That's what it sounds like the path forward is. And so there are people talking about how this could endanger the oil and gas economy in Colorado. So you can do a lot on economic development, but you also don't want to harm the things that are there and that are good. And there's concern that this bill may do that. Chris, I think you're a yes vote in the House. So let's go to you first and talk about how you're thinking about this particular piece of legislation that is a pretty all-encompassing reform and its impact on the economy. And then Betsy, as the Economic Development Director, I'd like you to be able to talk about that as well. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, just to clarify, so the House passed it on thirds. It's headed back to the Senate. They'll consider House amendments. If they concur, then will be onto the governor's office for signature. So yeah, I did vote yes on the final bill. I was really pleased with the amendment process that played out in the House. I think, as sometimes happens with bills like this, you'll see the first chamber hold the line, and the big negotiations kind of happen as it moves through the process, take the extra time that we have in the second chamber. And that's exactly what happened here. There was intense discussion within the caucus, with stakeholders from across the industry side, as well as some of the environmental advocacy groups on those amendments that we put on the House. I think I received thousands of emails. I think is not an understatement. I think everybody in the legislature did, and lots of those emails said to me, please vote no on this because this is just 112, Proposition 112 in bill form. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. There were no setbacks at all in the bill. The bill was very focused on health and safety, problem solving, and had nothing to do with setbacks. Now, I voted against 112 on last fall because I think the chance for serious economic dislocation and harm was very present with a one-size-fits-all statewide setback. So I was against that. Many of my colleagues, House Democrats, were against that proposition. This bill, Senate Bill 181, is very different. It is not a setback bill. And I think there were things that we looked at very carefully through the process to make sure we weren't causing massive economic dislocation or significant material economic dislocation. And interestingly, Anadarko, on March the 6th, in a communication to their shareholders, said, we don't think Senate Bill 181 has a material impact on our business. So think about that for a second. How could Senate Bill 181 be Proposition 112 if the largest operator in the state puts out a public statement to its investors, we don't think this will have a material impact?
So I'll answer that for you. That's I think that the industry is concerned about certain communities where there is a resource and whether those communities will do the kind of regulating that operates in effect as a silent ban. And I think that's how Anadarko doesn't, I think, see itself positioned in communities that are going to be they're going to be unreceptive to industry requests for permitting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also ask people to take a close look at the amendments that went on the House around reasonable and necessary language. So if we do get a local government that is exceeding legal authority, we've got a clear pathway for that to be evaluated in court. And I think that was an important part of the discussion.
Thanks. That's a good response. I appreciate that. Betsy?
Well, the bill is fundamentally about health and safety and local control, and I hear that, worried about some communities and taking that local control, but that's what the bill is about. But as Chris mentioned and the governor mentioned, so many of the utility companies are already making voluntary commitments to be renewable, 70% renewable by, 2030, and so they're all moving in that direction anyway, and I think the governor is really building on that. But also, let's face it, renewable energy energy jobs are growing at a much faster rate in the state of Colorado than jobs in the oil and gas industry. In a 5-year period, the last 5 years, our jobs in the clean energy industry increased by over 20%. Nationwide, I think that was at about 14%. It's already moving in that direction anyway.
Okay, well, thank you, and we're going to go to questions. There should be microphones going around. Right behind you is coming a microphone.
Hi, I'm Luke Beckett. I'm a graduate student at CU Boulder. So in terms of intermittency, a lot of policy incentives seem to be focused on the generation side or on, say, the technology side, such as storage. But have you explored policy incentives on the demand side, such as voluntary curtailment of distributed energy resources or demand side management, et cetera?
Do you want to take it? 'Cause
Happy
the
to.
answer is yes.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. Colorado, I think, has one of the leading demand-side management programs in the country. I will defer to, I know we've got the CEO of Excel, Alice Jackson, is here. She is going to speak to the group later in the day. I know she can cover that with a tremendous amount of specificity. The DSM program was actually increased by 20% more by the PUC last year. So that program just keeps getting better and better. So I think significant demand side work in Colorado. In fact, I heard someone joke that, but for marijuana grow houses, demand would have been flat in Colorado. So thank goodness we've got the grow houses. And of course, they're switching to LEDs now. So, back to flat, I'm afraid. But it is a really great story of conservation, of demand side management. And that will absolutely be part of the future ability to manage intermittency as renewable penetration goes up. It's going to be, I almost think about it as dispatchable load. It's one of the really exciting parts to me about the EV story is that we're going to have the ability to dispatch that load in a very precise way. I mean, I signed up for the Excel program where they can turn your air conditioner on and off on a hot summer day. That is like the tip of the iceberg when you think about the ability to control charging of EV fleets, of individual car owners. That will add tremendous flexibility to the power grid and make grid management much easier to handle as we increase more wind and solar.
We had Amory Lovins as our first keynote, and this was it's the power of energy efficiency was really his thesis. And so good question, and we think there's a lot still that can be done. When so my center did all of the convening for 13 Western states. They included North Dakota and South Dakota because they felt more like the West than the Midwest. And we looked at economic modeling for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Energy efficiency still penciled out as the least expensive way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because there's so much still that can be done in the world of demand-side management and energy conservation. Yes, so I just was waiting to see if there was a new questioner.
My question is, do you see a role for community choice aggregation where communities are allowed to purchase their electric utility and sever themselves from stockholder-owned utilities producing electricity? Do you see a role, you see a bill coming in that direction?
Chris, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one on. So this is a very active discussion in the state. Most folks in the room will be familiar with what's happened in Boulder. Pueblo is looking at a very similar set of activities to look at what would it need to do to become its own power company, its own municipal supplier, like what Colorado Springs has been for many decades. I think we may see legislation on that. I know the president of the Senate, who happens to be from Pueblo, announced that he was planning to bring legislation. I haven't seen it at this point, so we'll see if he follows through on that this session or not. I think it's an important part of the discussion. I would say that I would love to see more progress on the RTO side because I think it's an enabling activity to more customer choice across the spectrum, whether customer choice takes the form of municipalization or not. I think we are going to need better interconnection to manage the grid in a modern and efficient way. So I almost feel like we have some preamble, some pre-work that we need to do before we head a long ways down that track. That said, I think it's a super important debate that we need to have in the state.
And I'll say from our work with states, there are a variety of communities, and let's just use municipalities. But it could happen if it was a town, it could happen if it was, some other kind of a political entity that have their own goals in place. So Denver's a good example. It has a 100% renewable goal. And if you talk to most people about how actually to get to 100% renewable, folks in the utility industry can say we can get to 65 or 70, and then the incremental percentage is probably going to cost a little more, but we can get to that 70% and feel very comfortable. It's still affordable, but it's going to cost to go kind of beyond that. And really, I think very few people know how now, in an affordable way, you get all the way to 100, like today in 2019. And so one of the things that's being thought about in states across the country, and I think including some people in Colorado thinking about that, is how you would give the Public Utility Commission, and I'm pointing at our two commissioners, the ability to say to a utility that they regulate, okay, that community wants 100%, you can build out 100% for them, but if there's an incremental cost, we're not going to rate base that across the entire rate base. We're going to make it specific to that group, to the service provider area that is that municipality. And how there's places around the country that are doing this and doing it legislatively or doing it in a regulatory fashion. But I think that's probably likely to be the thing that happens more often than something that like California's community choice aggregation, which operates a little bit differently than that. And that's really what I think we're going to see.
We're
Yes.
Bill Leedy of the Leedy Foundation, Juneau, Alaska. Ms. Markey, in a few decades, we are going to have to accommodate thousands and then millions of people fleeing sea level rise. The new Okies, they'll put everything they own in the SUV and drive uphill. Mile High, Colorado will receive them. What are you planning to build for those folks who have lost their equity, unfortunately, where they have come from, that is free from the great mistake we made at the end of World War II, and that's building our cities for cars, not for people? What's your plan? I'm presenting a poster at the Smart Cities program tomorrow on a car-free solution. I'll have some for anybody who would like one. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And before I answer that question, I also just want to acknowledge that this whole conversation about the new energy economy and thinking about climate change and clean energy really started in 2006 when you were elected governor. And so a lot of these things that we're talking about today, you really started the conversation. So thank you for that, and all the work that's gone on with the different universities in Colorado. I can't tell you if we have a plan right now for that, but I do know in working with agriculture, with our transportation office, and again in what we are trying to do in terms of getting those companies in Colorado, not only to attract the ones that are going to be, again, good paying, clean jobs, but how can we incentivize those businesses? Because that's what we're in the business of helping businesses think more about how they can operate in a cleaner way as well. So I think a lot of continuing work needs to be done on that, and that's probably a topic of discussion for our energy working group at the cabinet level as well. What do we do about housing? What do we do about what are the jobs of the future? How does it again impact agriculture? And I think a lot more thought needs to go into that in the coming years as well, because our economy will definitely change, and there could be more people. Again, we already have almost 10,000 new people a month coming into Colorado, and what will happen as we see the impact of climate change. And so we do need to think about that.
It's one of the benefits of doing what you're doing as a cabinet, spreading this across several cabinets. I did get to meet and be in a meeting with the new director of transportation, and she very much understands the concept of transit-oriented design or transportation-oriented design. It can mean both, but how you design a transportation system that really is about clustering people and not spreading people out or causing, people to have to drive further distances and contribute to greenhouse gases. So,
Right. And I think those are the kinds of businesses that we want to attract that look at that as a very positive option to having their employees be able to easily get to work and not going in their car. Yeah.
thanks. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hello. Over here. Sorry, back where we were before.
Okay, okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm concerned that there's a level of science denial when it comes to energy, and for example, the countries that have decarbonized their grids, or provinces, or states, above 90% are Norway, Sweden, Finland, France, Ontario, Washington, parts of Brazil, and they rely almost entirely on both nuclear and hydro. The idea that renewables are cheaper is not true. If you look at California, they're paying double the average price for electricity of the United States. I'm wondering, Representative Hansen, you have a degree in nuclear engineering. Why aren't you talking about nuclear when we have, for example, this company called NuScale that's going to design the reactor and test it up at Idaho National Lab in 2022, and they can mass produce it and potentially bring it into Colorado and replace our coal plants with it. I'm just wondering, why are we ignoring it? I'm just very frustrated.
All right, I share your frustration. I appreciate the question, and this is one of my favorite subjects, so thanks for putting it on the floor today. I think there's kind of two parts to the answer. Part number one is what happened in South Carolina and Georgia. Westinghouse said they could build those plants for $10 billion. South Carolina got to $18 billion and said enough. Georgia is at $22 billion, and they're continuing. So unfortunately, the kind of giant reactor approach, which has been the typical way that France and the U.S. and others have approached this, right now the economics just don't work. Those are at $100 plus per megawatt hour in marginal cost. And so, sure, but I share your excitement about new technology. I mean, I can't wait for the next set of options that may very well be extremely competitive. We don't know yet. And I know the folks at NuScale. They have a great plan. They have, I think, great technology. There are a number of other reactor designs that are being tested, some supported by folks like Bill Gates. So there's a lot of time, energy, private, public research dollars going into this. Unfortunately, our current model of nuclear development is just not cost competitive. And the experience in South Carolina and Washington, I think, unfortunately, that's just where we are today. I hope it's not where we are 10, 20, 30 years from now, but it's the set of options that we currently have to choose from.
I would add to that answer, Chris, that you have to really have natural gas as part of the mix when you're thinking about why nuclear. So Illinois had a fairly difficult time with its clean energy plan and passing it. Illinois is about 50% nuclear, and they passed a bill that allowed Exelon to keep their nuclear in place. But in some respects, you could argue they're subsidizing that, and then partly they're subsidizing that because their options involve not just renewables, but renewables and gas together. And the same thing's true in New York. In Arizona, there's the Palo Verde nuclear plant. It's about 1,500 employees. And I think most people would look at the resource for solar and storage in New York and say you could supplant part of that power with solar and storage coming out of Palo Verde. But the owners of Palo Verde are hesitant to do that because at some point they'll be stranded in the asset. And so, Amory this morning said, listen, it's just too expensive. And I think what we don't consider when we talk about the expense of nuclear is not just nuclear vis-a-vis renewables, but nuclear vis-a-vis renewables and gas.
I got this great idea for stranded assets.
Securitize it. Okay, you had a question.
Hi, I'm Kyrie Baker, assistant professor at CU Boulder. This is related to the demand side management question. So a lot of other states have legislation around requiring smart meters to be installed on new construction or replacing analog electricity meters. I think this is a big step towards buildings being grid assets, and like stuff like the Excel Saver switch isn't going to help us forever. So does Colorado have any plans towards moving towards requiring smart meters?
Yeah, wonderful question. I know that PUC has looked at that. There has been a lot of work in that area. I'm going to let Alice take that one because I bet she's got tons and tons of information on that. And you're right, the Saver switch is not going to save us, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt.
So Alice Jackson, she's here, but she's the speaker today, the last keynote that we have of the day. And again, if you stick around and are able to ask her that question, that'd be great. Yes, sir? Microphone, maybe just, oh, no, there's someone in the back here. Stand up, please.
Yeah, Nick Mitchell, City of Fort Collins. So everybody loves renewables. Nobody loves transmission lines, especially not in their backyard. So do we have any policy plans that can help with that? Because it seems to be, that's kind of an elephant in the room. Nobody wants to ever build transmission.
Yeah, I would just say from our front, that would be our energy office, and it might be something, when is Will speaking? Will Tour?
He's not. That was
Oh,
an
he's
April
not.
Fool's
Okay.
joke to Chris Hansen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Don't worry, Will's on his way. It's an extremely important question. For the real energy geeks in the room, if you remember back in 2005, there was a Federal Energy Policy Act, and they had created a process there where the federal government could identify zones of congestion. And of course, out of that process came, all the high density areas in the country became zones of congestion. And it meant that FERC was given backstop authority to push forward on permitting new transmission lines if they got stuck because local state jurisdictions couldn't agree, they couldn't get the permits. And that process never really delivered, but it did, I think, give us an interesting idea that we might consider here in Colorado, which is some kind of, I almost think of it as sort of carrot and stick. This is so critical to the future of the state. These are multi-billion-dollar investments. They have kind of a second law of thermodynamics nature to them. There's no going back. Once you build the line, you've committed for decades. So we've got to get this right, and there will be places where I think we're going to need to work really hard to work through those log jams. You're absolutely right. Nobody wants a power line anywhere near them, but I think it's going to be a critical part of our success as a state to identify, the critical projects, the corridors, and create a process that is very, incentive carrot based to get it done. Because I think the alternative is going to be a much more costly system because we won't be taking advantage of the ability to share resource across the region. So it's imperative that we make progress on this, and there may be something we can learn from that particular piece of legislation.
It's a lot more costly, but the city of Fort Collins has a lot of their power lines buried. It's interesting. So that cost is significant vis-a-vis building them above ground, but you're a far more resilient electricity grid when your lines are underground than if they're above ground. So I think there have been times where Fort Collins had all of its power and other places next to it had very little or none because lines were susceptible to ice or to wind or those kinds of things. There's also microgridding, I think, and that's something, building out microgrids is this other response to this question about big transmission lines. And I don't think we have a real facility in the United States about microgrids yet. We're probably seeing Africa do more on the microgrid end or other places in the developing world, but I think we're going to learn a lot about that from the developing world. So we're going to maybe take one more question and then just give both of our speakers an answer, an opportunity to kind of close up. So, yes, sir, we have a question here.
Yeah, thank you. Rob Brown, Colorado School of Mines. I wanted to follow up just for a minute on what Bill was talking about over here about just designing communities perhaps for the future. Energy infrastructure is what it is, but as we look in the state of Colorado, there's been maybe over 200,000 net people in the last few years have moved here. We have a lot of congestion. There's transportation challenges. There's a lot of challenges related to the communities. And as we look at the scale of the global climate problem, if you will, it seems that we need more about what Amory was talking about with integrative design at the municipality level. So rethinking communities. It could involve microgrids, it can involve district heat, it can involve lots of things. Presuming that at the state level you would have legislature agreeing that that's a good idea, what would be the challenges in your guys' minds that would need to be overcome to begin moving away from the real estate developer who's king about land, infill development, no thought to roads and transportation. We just build houses. How do we tackle this in a more integrative solution way, at least from the regulatory or some view at the state level? What would be the challenges to trying to do that? Because we're going to need better designed communities to make real impact as well.
So I'm in 100% agreement, and I think we have a once-in-a-century opportunity that's going to be before us. And let me just quickly describe what that looks like. If you were to take a top-down picture of Los Angeles Basin, about 70% of the land area is used to drive or park a car. For those of you from Southern California, great job. 70%, and Denver's not much better. It might be 65 or something in Denver. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but we have a massive change in land use coming because of change in transportation options. One piece of it is mass transit and high-density corridors and TODs and all the things we were talking about before. The other piece of it, though, is autonomous electric vehicles, which are going to make individual car ownership not economically sensible. And I think we're going to have, therefore, a big change in land use because of that change. Are we going to need giant parking garages and parking lots in downtown areas? Are we going to need as many lanes of traffic when we have robot cars 2 centimeters apart on the highway using the existing infrastructure 80% more efficient is the estimate that I've read about. So play that tape forward and it radically changes land use and presents us an opportunity to do smart infill and smart grids and high density, high livability developments. And we've already seen a change generation to generation from my generation X to the current generation coming out of college. They want to live in downtown and they don't want a car. That has changed. That's a massive change from what my generation expected when they got their first job and started a family. To move to the suburbs and drive to work on a highway for half an hour. The problem is that half-hour drive is now an hour and 15 in most places. So I think we have this amazing opportunity coming with autonomous electric vehicles. It's going to change land use forever, and it's going to be our chance, I think, to really remake the way we use our space, and we can do it in a much smarter way. And and I don't want to say get out of jail free card, but this is going to be our best shot to remake that whole system. Well, to your point, and I'll turn this over to Betsy, because you're right. There's a ton of enabling legislation that has to occur to go with that. I think one of the most obvious ones to me is standards on building efficiency. I think it was a huge mistake for the Trump administration to peel back CAFE standards. These are the ways that we can make incremental progress year after year, put ourselves on a trajectory of 1%, 2%, 3% a year improvement, so that we get massive benefits by the time we reach mid-century. The alternative is absolute chaos and unlivable cities. And so I think, standards for appliances, standards for buildings, standards for our transportation infrastructure, that is one way that public policy can play a huge role in this transition.
And I totally agree with everything you're saying about land use, the move to the newer urbanism, so to speak. But I think so much of the challenge as well is at that local level, how do we at state government make sure that we're working with those local leaders? Because, in a community, nothing happens unless you've got that group of elected leaders or community leaders who understand and can be your partner. I mean, I know so often when we go out to communities and they're just not aware of possibly what's going on at the state level in terms of new legislation coming down the road or opportunities with grants and incentives that could be useful to them. So again, I think it's really critical for us to make sure that we're out there and talking to on a continual basis with community and elected leaders, so that we can work in partnership. And what we do here in Denver actually makes sense at the local level and is having an impact.
Well, thank you. I said I was going to give you some time for final comments, but we're actually out of time, and Mari Doby drives a really mean ship, so tight ship. So thank you very much. I greatly appreciate both of you, so thank you.